The ugly truth about loneliness is that it's an existential crisis. So what are you going to do about it? Loneliness is very common in today's society, obviously, and some of it has very practical causes. In modern society, we're very technically proficient. We're on social media a lot of the time. Uh, the playground for kids is now the smartphone. The meeting place is now social media. There's a famous cartoon where it says before and now, and it shows the mom shouting at the kid to come in, and nowadays kids with the mom shouting at the kid to go out. So when I was a kid, we all just went out, and I remember I was the youngest kid, so my mom at dinner time would send either of my two brothers and my sister. They'd have to come out and call me back in for dinner. And that was the way it was. Nowadays, of course, kids are inside, and even in houses, people are on multiple devices on their own. And even if we look at the architecture in society, many people live in apartments, and they're kind of like hotels, with apartments this side and that side, and there's a corridor. It's like a hotel. You'd never dream of talking to the next door neighbor. And even again, when I think of my youth, I wouldn't have thought twice about going into a neighbor's house. But even now, if you live in an independent house, how many people actually talk to each other? How many neighbors talk to each other? So there's many things in society that are causing, let's say, people to feel more lonely. But specifically in today's video, I just want to talk about what I'm calling or labeling the ugly truth of loneliness. And that's really, we're looking at the existential loneliness of a person who might well be in a crowd of people, and yet they feel that they are on their own. And this is a difficult type of loneliness to deal with. And a lot of people have this, and maybe you have this as well, that even though, you have friends, you have family, you have people who care about you, and yet you feel that a lot of the time, somehow, you could be lying in bed at night with your wife or your husband or your girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever, and feel alone, feel lonely. And that's not a good place to be. So what is it, and how can we deal with it? Okay, so just what I talked about just a minute ago is basically a typical loneliness that we can feel in society. And I'll give a few tips about that later in the video. But this existential loneliness, this loneliness even when you're surrounded by people, yet you feel alone. What is causing it? And what's actually causing it is that the human being has to deal with a lot of trauma. So just think, even when you're born, when you come out of the womb, it's quite traumatic coming out of the womb. And the first thing somebody does is they spank you on the bottom. So you're spanked on the bottom. You're assaulted within seconds of coming out of the womb. You have to learn how to eat and go to the toilet, and you walk and you fall and all this stuff. You go to school, and you have to deal with other school kids. And it's like trauma after trauma after trauma. And one of the ways that our mind deals with trauma is repression. And repression is whereby we dampen down the feelings. And this is also how antidepressants work, and also why a lot of people suffer antidepressants, because they feel like they're kind of like a zombie version of themselves. Because you're repressing, see, repression is a flat tool. It will repress everything, good and bad. And so to deal with the trauma, we end up repressing our feelings. So the problem with this is that bit by bit, and over a period of time in life, people become, perhaps we could say, more and more cocooned. And it can eventually reach a stage whereby a person is actually disenfranchised from themselves. They become, to some degree, depersonalized or distanced from who they really are. Another interesting aspect of this, if we look at the famous French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, he talked about the mirror stage of development of the child. And that basically the child is looking at the world like I'm looking at a mirror. So right is left and left is right. And the problem with this is that we don't really see who we are. So we see aspects of ourselves, mirrored image of ourselves, and how other people talk about us. Jimmy is just like his uncle. Sandra is like that girl we used to know, etc. Okay? So it's not just a physical image, but the mirror image of how we seem to be in society. And so we start falling in love with this false image of who we are, and we develop a false personality, a false self. And along the way, we learn to be attracted to certain things or pursue certain things in life. but often they are the false self. But there's also a true self. What is a true self? The true self is who you really are deep down, the way you're actually born, the sort of person you really are. We see it in small kids. They're very much true self is there. And after a while, the child learns in the first few years of life to adapt. And bit by bit, that true self leaves until by the teenage years, it just seems to be vanished completely, okay? But you can get back to that true self. And the thing with the true self is that everybody is an individual. Everybody has a destiny, okay? And you're meant to be your true self. And your true self is not based on, things like having loads of money or loads of friends or being a big success. That's not why anybody was born. Nobody was born to be rich or to be famous. That's not the purpose of life. So each person or each soul who incarnates in this earth has some kind of purpose that's bigger than just making money. And our society is living on such a superficial level. It tends to be about money, fame, and status. And there's three things, money, fame, and status, that we tend to see in society. But obviously, it's not for everybody. It's nice if you have it, but it's not for everybody. So how do you get back to this real self, this true self? And remember, the reason why the true self is happy is that it's congruent. The inner you and outer you is congruent. So the problem with a lot of people is that outwardly they're going to the gym, they have a six-pack even, they have a very dynamic and happy life. But inwardly, the real person who they are is starving inside. Like they're like a skeleton in those horror movies where they have a skeleton, they have somebody inside a room somewhere and they're starving. That's the real you. The real you is starving. What does the real you need for food? You see, human beings are consciousness. We are consciousness in a body, but we are basically the person we are is conscious. And human beings thrive on the food of consciousness. And what is that food? That food is feelings and perceptions. And so those feelings and perceptions which are congruent with, in line with who you really are as a person, will make you feel good and whole and happy. And the closer you get to that true self, the happier you'll be, because that true self is now being fed by experiences and attitudes and thoughts and feelings and imaginations which are congruent with its nature. We become happier the more closer we are to our true nature. And I mean that very much in the broadest sense, because I know some people might misread that and say, oh, my true nature be a terrible person. Well, no, that's not your true nature. That's also a false nature. Believe me, it's always a false one. True nature being who you really are, maybe a very, lively person, maybe a very serious person, maybe a very deep person, maybe a person who's superficial but knows everybody. There's so many endless varieties of people and types out there, but it's becoming who you really are and nurturing those aspects of yourself. So if you just think of it this way, if you're following this mirror image and it's a false self, and you do all these things which you think will make you happy, but it's not really making you happy because you actually have different needs. So your inner need is not being met. So this existential loneliness is always caused by a disenfranchisement of the real self, and the real self, the true self, is starving in the corner somewhere inside your mind. And so you need to nurture that self. And how do you do that? You need to go and do some self-exploration. I personally feel diary writing is very good because you can do all sorts of things. You can do meditation, you can go to therapy, you can do self-development classes, you can watch videos, read books, talk to people, develop better networks of friends, etc. But if you don't reflect on it, how will you learn? Because what you have to do is expose yourself to different experiences, different people, and then see which ones resonate. You go to acting class, you don't like acting class. You go to skiing class, you don't like skiing class. You go to bridge club and it turns out you like bridge. Oh my God, I never knew I liked bridge. I remember seeing a famous actor, one of my icons. I always loved Christopher Lee, the guy who did Dracula, and he did the twin, what's that one? The Lord of the Rings and all that stuff. And in his 60s, I think it was, he discovered he had a really good baritone voice. He actually had an operatic voice, but didn't really know it. So we have to expose ourselves to certain things, start finding out what sticks, what do I really like doing, and spending more time doing that. And it's really about befriending yourself, because there's a difference between alone and lonely. You could be on your own and very happy. And we see a lot of small kids are very happy on their own. But we see a lot of people, usually bigger people, are not happy on their own. And it's because they're disenfranchised and they feel alienated from themselves. and they have to keep stimulating themselves. They can never be on their own, stimulating, because deep down they're not really satisfied or happy with themselves. And so you need to explore yourself and find out what makes you work and what makes you happy, and give you more of those experiences which are fulfilling for your personality type. And that will cure your existential loneliness. I said earlier in the video I'd talk briefly about dealing with loneliness in general. So the other type of loneliness, I'm going to talk about two more versions. The first one I want to talk about is just loneliness in general, because with our modern society, you could end up, you have to go to a new city or living in a hostel. You go to college living in a hostel, you move country, and it's just lonely. Now, you're not having the existential lying on my bed, crying myself to sleep loneliness, but you just feel lonely. And how do we cope with that practical side of everyday loneliness? Well, what we've got to do is create an ecosystem around us that no matter where we go, we have an ecosystem. I remember some years ago, I had some interaction with the Carmelite order, Discalced Carmelites in the Roman Catholic Church. And they were saying that their house is always the same. It doesn't matter, it could be in Nicaragua, it could be in Italy, it could be in France, it could be in America, it could be in Ireland. And every Carmelite house is the same. The basic house was the same. And the idea of that was no matter where you get moved to as a Discalced Carmelite, you'll feel like it's the same place. Some hotel chains have done that as well. The Hilton hotels, they literally look the same everywhere. So it doesn't matter what country, you're always looking good and feeling good. And this is also true for ourselves, that, the more you learn about yourself, the more you know what you need. And surround yourself by the things that you need. And people talk about the difference between needs and wants. And strictly speaking, we probably just need 3 meals a day. But some people's wants are their needs. They actually need these things. It might technically be wants, but they'll feel happier with it. So create a network of friends around you. Maybe certain TV shows you watch. Maybe if you go to a new place, take up a new hobby. But you need to surround yourself by inputs which are going to make you feel good, even if you're not with the nearest and dearest. The final one I want to talk about on loneliness, third one, is, and this is the second ugly truth. The first ugly truth is loneliness really is existential crisis. And the second ugly truth is that to some degree everybody has to suffer from a certain amount of loneliness, because we are one with the womb and the mom, and then we're cleaved out of that. And people often say, well, we spend the rest of our life trying to get back into the womb. That's symbolically speaking. But the point is, we're in a state of oneness and then we're divided. And so there's a certain amount of separation as a human being. And if you are a deep feeling human being who's really on the human journey of growing and developing as a person, you will go through certain experiences at certain times whereby you do feel kind of a sense of loss, a nostalgia, something that's missing, a wistfulness. And that's a different type of loneliness. This is instead of an existential crisis, this is an existential opportunity, because if you sit with those feelings of sometimes feeling like you miss your childhood, or you miss somebody who's passed away, for example, or there's just some sense of some loss or whatever it is, we're metaphorical beings and we're deeply emotional beings. And when we go deep into ourselves, we explore those thoughts and feelings which are deep. And so we see with artists, for example, but we shouldn't, see that as a bad thing. So sometimes not feeling good can be good if you take it in the right light, that I'm sitting with feelings I don't like. I'm sitting with thoughts which I'm not so happy about. I'm sitting with the angst of being a human being. I'm sitting with the angst of being a conscious awareness. And so that's actually a positive existential loneliness, because it's not the existential loneliness of I'm lost in the universe. It's the existential loneliness that to some degree I am alone in the universe, or I am unique in the universe, or that, no matter what I do, I can never fully understand another person, or they can never fully understand me, or that there's certain aspects of human life which I can never really, there's certain experiences I have and I can never really fully understand them, or I can never fully express them, or I can't quite reach that point where I have it, or I'm expressing or feeling and exploring something, but I can't put my words on it. And this is artistic depth, and this is mystical experience. It always goes beyond language, because we're housed in language. But we can go beyond language, but we can't talk about our experiences beyond language. And this is the metaphorical loneliness, the spiritual loneliness, the dark night of the soul. So that can actually be good. So sometimes if you're lonely, it's not necessarily that you are in crisis or that you don't love yourself. Sometimes you're just lonely because you're a conscious being and you're exploring consciousness. Okay, hope that helps. Please like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you next time.